Zoom is also letting you know that it's going to be recorded as well. So thanks again for being here. We're really excited to see you all. I'm Tiffany Pewitt. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Diversity and Civic Life. And I'm really just thrilled that we're able to host this very important talk today, Christianity versus Democracy, an introduction to Christian nationalism and Texas politics, with Dr. David R. Brockman. Dr. Brockman is a religious studies scholar and Christian theologian who currently serves as a non-resident scholar at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. He also teaches religious studies courses at Texas Christian University and courses in religion and politics at Bright Divinity School. He's a frequent contributor to the Texas Observer, Religion Dispatches, Preachy, and other publications. For the Baker Institute, Dr. Brockman has written several scholarly analyses. Texas Christian Nationalists Respond to COVID-19, published in 2021. Christian Americanism and Texas Politics since 2008, published in 2020. And Religious Imbalance in the Texas Social Studies Curriculum, Analysis and Recommendations, published in 2016. He's also the author of No Longer the Same, Religious Others and the Liberation of Christian Theology, published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2011, and Dialectical Democracy Through Christian Thought, Individualism, Relationalism, and American Politics, published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2013. And he lives with his spouse in Fort Worth, Texas. Before I turn this over to Dr. Brockman, I do want to mention a couple of things as well. We're asking that everyone stay muted through this, and that all questions be saved until the end, and we will have a period for Q&A. We ask that you put your questions in the chat, and then I will read those questions out during the Q&A period for Dr. Brockman to respond to. And with that, I'd like to turn this over to Dr. Brockman so that he can illuminate us on this very timely and important topic. So let me spotlight you. Okay.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for inviting me to speak about Christian nationalism, which has been the focus of my research and writing for the past several years. My plan here is to offer an introduction to the ideology of Christian nationalism on the national stage, and then to discuss where we find this ideology on the political landscape here in Texas. And after that, I'll be happy to field any questions that you may have through the chat, as Tiffany said earlier. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here, and let's see. Here we go. So there's information about me here, and as well as our title, Christianity versus Democracy, ? And Introduction to Christian Nationalism and Texas Politics. And if you're interested in looking at some of the work that Tiffany mentioned before, this is my experts page. I feel a little immodest using the word experts in that way, but that's what it's called. So anyway, the experts page is there, and you can find various writings of mine. I should say that I'm recovering from a bout of intestinal flu this week, and if I seem a little less than scintillating, please chalk it up to that rather than some kind of personality flaw on my part. Anyway, let's begin with some quotes from Texans, many of whom are probably quite familiar to you. Whoops. Oh, no, I see. Let's try that again. And let me run back through here. This counts as less than scintillating, by the way, so just in case. Here we go. All right. So the first quote that we have here is from someone you probably recognize, Governor Greg Abbott, from 2015, the values that Christ teaches were the values and principles on which this nation was founded. There's another person you may recognize, Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick. This was when these quotes are from when he was a state senator. We are a Judeo-Christian nation, primarily a Christian nation, and there is no such thing as separation of church and state. This is Pastor Robert Jeffress, the lead pastor at First Baptist Dallas. And Pastor Jeffress says, these are from a book of his called Twilight's Last Gleaming. The fact that our Constitution demands that everyone have the freedom to embrace any religious beliefs or no religious beliefs does not mean that the government cannot demonstrate a preference for Christianity over other religions. And also in that same text, he writes, the framers of the Constitution did not hesitate to declare that America was a Christian nation. The First Amendment does not even require that the government treat all faiths equally. Another person may not be that recognizable. I'll talk more about him later. This is amateur historian and Republican activist David Barton, writing back in 1992. His position has remained the same since then. There is no wall of separation in the Constitution unless it is a wall intended by the founding fathers to keep the government out of the church. So from these quotes, you should have at least a general idea of what's at the heart of Christian nationalism. It's the belief that the founders of our nation intended it to be an explicitly Christian nation, and that the US should be an explicitly Christian nation again today. So let's explore that a little further. Christian nationalism is also known as Christian Americanism. I'm using Christian nationalism here because that seems to be the most widely accepted term. It's a religio-political ideology which holds that America was founded to be a Christian nation governed by Bible-based laws, that the country has tragically departed from its roots, and that it should reclaim its Christian identity. Adherents of Christian nationalism believe that the Bible and Christian teaching, typically theologically conservative in nature, should determine law and public policy making. They also deny that the founders intended to separate church and state, except, as we saw in that Barton quote, to keep government from interfering with religion, but not vice versa. In other words, Christian nationalism consists of two related parts. One historical, having to do with what was in the past, and one normative, having to do with what should be today. The first, the historical, involves the historical claim that the founders intended to create a nation that would be guided by Christian beliefs. The second involves the claim that law and public policy today should once again be governed by Christian teaching, that Christianity, in other words, should have a privileged role in society and government. Now, the historical claim about the intent of the founders is really a matter for historians and political scientists to debate. I'm not a historian or a political science, I'm a religious studies scholar, but there seems to be a consensus among scholars of early US history that though the founders were likely influenced by some Christian beliefs and teachings, they worried that too close a relationship between religion and the state would be detrimental to both. In other words, the opposite of the Christian nationalist claim that the founders wanted to privilege the Christian religion. But again, I'll leave that to scholars of history and political science, but I'll be happy to recommend a couple of historians if you're interested. Christian nationalist normative claim, though, concerns us all because the drive to privilege one religion over others threatens our pluralistic democracy, as I'll discuss in a moment. Now, I should note that advocates of Christian nationalism generally do not identify themselves as such. In fact, many reject the Christian nationalist label altogether. Evangelical leader and Trump ally Franklin Graham claims that, quote, Christian nationalism doesn't exist, that it's, quote, just another name to throw at Christians. However, scholars and other observers, including myself, find the term helpful in describing those who believe that the United States should be a Christian nation. So how many people are we talking about? That's hard to say, since people don't self-identify as Christian nationalists as they do, say, conservative or liberal or Republican or Democratic. Scholars have to look instead at beliefs as expressed in surveys. And in their landmark 2020 study, Taking America Back for God, Christian Nationalism in the United States, sociologist Andrew Whitehead here in the center and Samuel Perry on the right examined responses to the 2017 Baylor religion surveys, responses to statements like, the federal government should declare the United States a Christian nation, and the federal government should advocate Christian values. And by the way, I'll be citing Whitehead and Perry quite a bit in this talk. Whitehead and Perry estimate that around 20% of the US population, about 1 in 5 Americans, strongly affiliate with Christian nationalism. If they're correct, that translates to around 52 million adults. And that includes about 20% of whites, 15% of Hispanics, and a little surprisingly to me, about 20% of African Americans. But that does account for Black Christian nationalist politicians like Larry Elder in California and Alan West here in Texas. By the way, I had the pleasure of participating in a webinar with Whitehead and Perry and author Catherine Stewart, whom I'll mention in a little bit, last year. The webinar was sponsored by the Baker Institute, and I'll send Tiffany a link to that then to distribute out to those in the audience. Now, Americans believe all sorts of things. So why does Christian nationalism in particular deserve our attention? And this gets to the title of this talk, Christianity versus Democracy, followed by a question mark. At its core, Christian nationalism isn't like other political actors on the national stage, say labor unions or environmental activists or those pushing for LGBTQ equality or police reform, activists who have a set of issues they care about and policies they advocate, and who are prepared to fight it out in the jostle of the small d democratic arena. Christian nationalism, on the other hand, is fundamentally anti-democratic. Whitehead and Perry write, quote, Christian nationalism has its own version of the elect, those chosen by God. They are people like us, meaning conservative Christian. Only the elect should control the political process, while others must be closely scrutinized, discouraged, or even denied access, end quote. And interestingly, as Whitehead and Perry found, white Christian nationalists are more likely to believe that we make it too easy to vote in the United States. And they're much more likely to believe that voter fraud is getting rampant. In other words, in insisting that America should be an essentially Christian nation, Christian nationalists seek to stack the political deck, or to borrow one of Donald Trump's favorite phrases, to rig the system in favor of their own beliefs and political positions, and disadvantage or perhaps even disenfranchise those who don't agree, members of other religions, progressive Christians, secular Americans, basically anyone who doesn't share the conservative evangelical beliefs that Christian nationalists tend to espouse. But what appears to be behind this drive to stack the electoral deck in favor of conservative Christians is, as I mentioned earlier, the belief that the US has strayed from its allegedly biblical founding principles in several key areas. And this brings us to what we might call the Christian nationalist agenda. Now, it's no easy task to identify this agenda because Christian nationalism is not an organized movement like a political party. There's no Christian nationalist platform to which activists must subscribe. Instead, determining what policies Christian nationalists support or oppose is a matter of drawing on information from various sources publications, public statements, campaign rhetoric, social media posts, and other sources, including survey results, such as those Whitehead and Perry draw upon. And from these various sources, we can identify several key issues which Christian nationalists rally around. The most common hot button issues for Christian nationalists are bans on official school prayer, legalization of abortion, and LGBTQ equality, especially same-sex marriage. For instance, Pastor Jeffress, in his 2016 book, Twilight's Last Gleaming, calls the Supreme Court rulings behind these legal and policy changes, and I quote, explosions that made the implosion of our nation inevitable, end quote. He describes these developments as rebelling against God and warns of, quote, the natural collapse that comes from removing the spiritual and moral support structures of a society, end quote. Similarly, David Barton blamed climate change, not on the burning of fossil fuels, but on the legalization of abortion, which he claimed, quote, opened a door that lost God's protection over our environment, end quote. So school prayer, abortion rights, and LGBTQ equality are prominent areas of concern for Christian nationalists. And then there's the 2020 presidential election and its aftermath. You may have run across the term Christian nationalism in several articles published just after that January 6th Capitol insurrection. Here are a few from the New York Times, Time Magazine, and National Public Radio. And there were signs of Christian nationalism all over the insurrection. Just show a few here. Here we have Jesus and a "Don't Tread on Me" sign, and a Trump flag here. Here's Donald Trump as Rambo, I guess, with his automatic weapon and "Make America Godly Again," Trump hat, Trump flags, and a cross. In the wake of the insurrection, Whitehead and Perry wrote that, quote, white Christian nationalists see the nation as their own, both historically and theologically. So any presidential election that does not produce the desired result must be illegitimate. True patriots in this understanding have the right, the duty even, to take it back by force if necessary, end quote. Now, January 6th, of course, was a pro-Trump event, and Donald Trump, more than any recent GOP figure, is the embodiment of Christian nationalist aspirations. Despite his very sketchy personal ties to Christianity, he campaigned hard for the white evangelical vote, and both as a candidate and as president, he enthusiastically embraced Christian nationalist causes, such as promising to nominate anti-abortion judges, restricting the service of transgender troops, and his attempts to limit Muslim immigration into the US. And no wonder Christian nationalist Michelle Brockman called Trump a godly biblical president. And Christian nationalists, in return, enthusiastically embraced him. Whitehead and Perry found that Christian nationalist belief was the strongest religious predictor of whether an individual would vote for Trump in 2016. Stronger even than identification as an evangelical. But of course, Trump isn't the only prominent Christian nationalist on the national scene. Last month, Right Wing Watch tweeted this video of Colorado Representative Lauren Boebert voicing Christian nationalist sentiment, declaring that Christians must rise up and remove ungodly leaders from power and replace them with people who realize that the government should be taking orders from the church. There are many other movers and shakers. Many other movers and shakers in the national GOP are Christian nationalists, including former VP Mike Pence, Michelle Brockman, I've mentioned her before, U.S. Senator Josh Hawley of Missouri, Ben Carson, a former GOP presidential candidate and former HUD secretary, and former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Now, it's at this point that we can connect Christian nationalism on the national stage, which I've been covering, with Christian nationalism here in Texas. Because on the national stage, as well as here in Texas, one of the most influential Christian nationalists is one of the least well-known. And he's a Texan, amateur historian and political activist David Barton. NPR called him the most influential evangelist you've never heard of. Former Kansas governor and Trump official Sam Brownback has said that Barton provided, quote, the philosophical underpinning for a lot of the Republican effort in the country in recent years. Barton's nonprofit Wall Builders seeks to, quote, educate the nation concerning the godly foundation of our country and, quote, provide information to federal, state, and local officials as they develop public policies which reflect biblical values, end quote. Barton's radio program / podcast, Wall Builders Live, gives Barton a platform for his Christian nationalist message. Carried by nearly 300 radio stations, as well as iTunes and TuneIn, the show has featured topics such as Christian nation, when did this become a controversy in America? And Christian heritage, yet ungodly policies. In her book, The Power Worshippers, author Catherine Stewart calls Barton the Where's Waldo of the Christian nationalist movement. And Barton does seem to pop up everywhere. He was at the center of the 2009 controversy over the Texas Social Studies curriculum standards. He served as one of the expert reviewers of the standards, despite his lack of academic qualifications, and he pushed for Christian nationalist ideas in the standards. And I discuss Barton's role and Christian nationalism in the standards in that Baker Institute report from 2016, Religious Imbalance in the Texas Social Studies Standards. Barton also headed a super PAC backing Ted Cruz's 2016 presidential bid. Here he is on the right with Senator Cruz and Senator Cruz's father, Rafael Cruz, an itinerant pastor and also Christian nationalist. And Barton also serves on the steering team of Project Blitz. It's a Christian nationalist campaign which first gained widespread attention thanks to reporting by Frederick Clarkson. Project Blitz works to push state legislatures across the country to enact bills that, quote, recognize the place of Christian principles in our nation's history and heritage, and that promote, quote, biblical values concerning marriage and sexuality. The Project Blitz legislative playbooks, and this is the title page from the most recent one, contain model bills covering everything from displaying "In God We Trust" in classrooms, to school prayer, to shielding those who discriminate on grounds of sincerely held belief. And these model bills can be tailored by legislators to their own states. One of the Project Blitz model bills was just passed by the Texas legislature and signed into law by Governor Abbott this year. I'll discuss it in a moment. But Barton is only one of a boatload of Texans of varying prominence who espouse Christian nationalism. Indeed, the Lone Star State is a hotbed of the ideology, and I explore its impact on the Texas political landscape in a report published last spring by the Baker Institute for Public Policy under what I admit is not a very sexy title, Christian Americanism in Texas Politics Since 2008. Just trips off the tongue, doesn't it? As I mentioned earlier, Christian Americanism is synonymous with Christian nationalism. So I'm talking about the same thing here, which is a different term. Since there had previously been no systematic study of Christian nationalism in Texas, I set out in this report to, so to speak, map the territory. Who are the major proponents of Christian nationalism in Texas since 2008? And what means do they use to promote the ideology? The first part of the report offers a kind of who's who of Christian nationalism in Texas since 2008. I profile 6 prominent and influential lawmakers and 12 non-governmental Christian nationalists, including political activists, ministers, and major donors. The profiles indicate the degree to which each figure appears to embrace the ideology and the type of influence each exerts. Among the lawmakers profiled are some familiar names in Texas politics: Senator Ted Cruz, Representative Gohmert, former Governor Rick Perry, current Governor Greg Abbott, and Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick. The non-governmental activists profiled are Barton, author and media personality Glenn Beck, self-described political operative David Lane, doctor and activist Steve Hotze, one of the heads of Conservative Republicans of Texas, based in Houston, economist Gary North, oil and gas developer Tim Dunn, major funder for the Texas Public Policy Foundation and Empower Texans, I believe. The billionaire donors Dan and Ferris Wilks, also connected to the oil and gas industry, and pastors Rafael Cruz, father of Ted, Robert Jeffress, mentioned him before, Dave Welch, who is the head of the U.S. Pastors Council and the Texas Pastors Council, and John Hagee. The report then explores the means these Christian nationalist lawmakers and activists use to promote the ideology. And there's a wide range of means, not only books and other publications and mass media outlets you might expect, but also nonprofit organizations, PACs and super PACs, social media, churches, other religio-political gatherings, and then of course legislation. Like many public figures these days, several of our state's most prominent Christian nationalists regularly take to social media to spread their message, and they've gained quite an audience. For instance, as of February 2020, and my report was published in 2020, so that's why these statistics are a little out of date, but as of February 2020, Barton's Wall Builders Facebook site had nearly 180,000 follows. Pastor Jeffress, here on the right with Donald Trump, is also active on social media. He had over 217,000 Facebook followers as of February 2020. And in 2019, Jeffress posted an image of the Statue of Liberty emblazoned with the quote, "Our country was founded as a Christian nation." The post had received over 2,800 likes by the following day. Another means that Christian nationalists use are nonprofits and super PACs that promote Christian nationalist ideas and activities. And here are two examples, both involving Christian billionaires Dan and Ferris Wilks. Dan and Ferris Wilks here, who are residents of Cisco, Texas, at least last I heard, and they're known as the Koch brothers of the Christian right. First, Dan Wilks, a nonprofit Heavenly Fathers Foundation, has helped to fund David Lane's Pastors and Pews efforts, which offer free lodging and meals for pastors and their spouses, enabling them to hear messages from Christian nationalists such as Rick Perry, Abbott, Ted Cruz, Rafael Cruz, and Barton. Second, Ferris Wilks and members of his family reportedly gave $15 million to the super PAC headed by David Barton that backed Senator Cruz's ultimately unsuccessful 2016 presidential bid. For me, the most interesting finding in the report involves Christian nationalist use of legislation to push their agenda. And given the core Christian nationalist claim that the founders intended that Christianity would shape US law and public policy and that it should do so today, one might reasonably expect to see sympathetic legislators introduce bills giving preferential treatment to Christianity. However, few measures explicitly favoring Christianity have been filed in the Texas legislature over the past decade. There have been a few, but very few, surprisingly few. And instead, sympathetic legislators have filed myriad bills that, though not explicitly pro-Christian, would arguably advance the Christian nationalist agenda. And these include measures allowing school prayer or carving out religious liberty exceptions. These bills are couched, however, in terms of protecting religion generally, for instance, shielding persons who discriminate against others according to sincerely held religious beliefs, rather than privileging Christianity explicitly. For instance, this year, the legislature passed legislation clearly fashioned after one of the Project Blitz model bills. Senate Bill 797 requires that public schools and public universities prominently display the motto, "In God We Trust," if the poster or display is either donated for use in the institution or paid for by privately donated funds. In other words, the school or institution can't pay for it directly. This follows a model bill in the 2020-2021 Project Blitz legislative playbook. I showed you the title page of it earlier. In God We Trust, of course, has been the national motto since 1956. And furthermore, its reference to God does not necessarily signify Christian notions of the divinity, for example, the Holy Trinity. As such, it can be thought of as a generic reference to some higher power, and thus, so the motto's supporters say, not offensive to any religious group, except atheists, of course. However, the legislation appears to be part of a nationwide push by the Christian nationalist Project Blitz to, as one opponent put it, quote, infiltrate state legislatures with religion and to, quote, codify a far-right evangelical Christian America. And indeed, in the latest Project Blitz legislative playbook, the authors comment that "In God We Trust" is, quote, more than just a motto. It is our country's foundation and an important part of our identity as Americans. The Project Blitz authors also note that legislation like this, quote, can shore up later support for other governmental entities to support religious displays. Governor Abbott signed Senate Bill 797 into law earlier this year. However, legislation doesn't need to mention God or Christianity to further the Christian nationalist agenda. That agenda may be concealed behind the language of religious liberty or sincerely held beliefs, and that might appear pluralistic, but is mainly intended to shield conservative Christians. Indeed, legislation need not mention religion at all in order to advance the Christian nationalist agenda. Here are two examples that became law just this year. Senate Bill 8, the anti-abortion bounty hunter bill law, which is coming up before the Supreme Court next Monday, is the last I heard, and Senate Bill 3, the bill prohibiting the teaching of critical race theory in public schools. Both bills were authored by State Senator Brian Hughes of Mineola. Here he is with Lieutenant Governor and Senate President Dan Patrick. Hughes does not seem to be as outspokenly Christian nationalist as Governor Patrick or Governor Abbott or Lieutenant Governor Patrick, but he does sound Christian nationalist themes in some public statements. For instance, in a 2015 Thanksgiving message to constituents, Hughes referred to, quote, our founders' unshakable belief in God as the foundation of our nation and a firm reliance upon him from whom all blessings flow, end quote. And in 2019, Hughes filed a bill, ultimately unsuccessful, but filed a bill that would have required instruction on the Bible in public school English classes. Again, that never passed, but that was it says something about State Senator Hughes's where he lines up. The first of Hughes's two bills that I'll talk about here is SB8, which bans abortions after 6 weeks of pregnancy and enforces that ban by allowing private individuals to sue anyone who aids an abortion after that period. SB8 doesn't mention Christianity or religion or sincerely held beliefs. But in banning nearly all abortions in Texas, it clearly advances the Christian nationalist agenda, which is resolutely anti-abortion. Much the same is true with Hughes's anti-critical race theory bill, SB3, which Governor Abbott signed into law last month. Like SB8, it doesn't mention Christianity, religion, or beliefs. Instead, it prohibits teachers from teaching, among other things, that, quote, the advent of slavery in the United States constituted the true founding of the United States, or from teaching that, quote, slavery and racism are anything other than deviations from, betrayals of, or failures to live up to the authentic founding principles of the United States, end quote. And these references to the true founding and the authentic founding principles suggest the link to Christian nationalism. Christian nationalists tend to treat the founding as kind of a sacred event, divinely inspired. And the founding documents, such as the Constitution, is tantamount to sacred scripture. As Hughes put it in that Thanksgiving message, God is the foundation of our nation. Accordingly, the notion that the motives of the founders were anything but pure, or that there is systematic racism at the heart of the Constitution, which, by the way, is pretty easy to demonstrate, in my opinion, strikes at the very heart of their belief in the religious founding. Now, Senate Bills 3, 8, and 797 all passed the legislature and were signed into law. However, bills don't have to actually become law to have an impact favorable to Christian nationalists. For one thing, just filing a bill, say promoting school prayer or banning abortion, helps a legislator define herself to constituents as one of us, those who believe that America was founded to be and should be again a Christian nation. It's a kind of politics as performance. For another thing, as Project Blitz researcher Clarkson notes, even bills that don't pass can put opposing legislators on the record and open them to charges of being anti-religion or against religious liberty. The latest Project Blitz legislative playbook advises Christian nationalist legislators to think strategically. The goal of a given bill may not be passage as much as educating the public on a given issue or changing the terms of the discussion, or to get opponents on a recorded vote, opening them to attack and negative publicity. Clarkson writes about a Minnesota case. Republican State Senator Dan Hall in Minnesota introduced an amendment to an education bill, very similar to SB 797, allowing privately funded displays of In God We Trust in the public schools, same model bill in the Project Blitz legislative playbook. The measure passed, but Hall then went on Fox and Friends, where he called Democratic opponents of the bill part of an anti-faith movement that seeks to suppress religion and wipe it out of government. Now, I'm tempted to say that Hall is just a sore winner, but it may well be that his strategy wasn't just to get In God We Trust into public schools, but also to faith bait those who disagree. So in conclusion, Christian nationalism is likely to remain a potent force nationally and in Texas politics for some time to come. It poses a clear challenge to separation of church and state, as well as the rights of minorities, religious and secular, who could become effectively second-class citizens in the nation that Christian nationalists envision. As a bastion of Christian nationalism, Texas exerts significant influence on the national political landscape, however shadowy that influence may occasionally be. Those who care deeply about preserving church-state separation, civil liberties, and a pluralistic democracy would do well to keep a close eye on the politics of the Lone Star State. So that concludes my remarks, and I welcome the upcoming Q&A. And Tiffany, I'll stop the share here, I guess. Is that okay?
Sure.
Okay, there we go.
Yeah, and if anyone has any questions, please do put those in the chat. Well, while maybe folks are thinking, oh, wait, here's a question. All right. Excellent. Paula asked, how do we anticipate and counteract the Blitz?
Project Blitz. That's a good question. What I'd strongly recommend if you're interested in that is to follow Frederick Clarkson. You can maybe what I should do is include in, along with the other links that I'll share with Dr. Pewitt later after this session, a link to one of Fred Clarkson's articles on Project Blitz, which includes a lot of links back to his earlier work. One thing you can do to anticipate is to read the legislative playbook or get familiar with the legislative playbook. That it was publicly available in earlier years, 2018 to 2019, 2017 to 2018, 2019, 2020, and then this current one, 2020 to 2021, was kind of covert. It wasn't publicly available, but Fred Clarkson managed to find a copy and make it available through his articles and his website. And so you can take a look at what Project Blitz is doing that way. And then Fred Clarkson also has been publicizing, I think he's behind what's called Blitz Watch, which is a website on the web that tracks the appearance of Project Blitz model bills in legislatures and so forth across the nation. And that's another good resource for you. So Frederick Clarkson is a good person to follow on that in that regard.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Van. Why is Judeo-Christian a term that Christian nationalists are so attached to?
Yeah, that I talk about this in the report. By the way, the Christian Americanism and Texas Politics report that most of the information in my talk comes from that 2020 report, and it's freely available on the Baker Institute website. We'll get a link to you on so that you can take a look at it. But Judeo-Christian has kind of an interesting history. It was originally developed by liberals or progressives back in the 1930s and 40s and this is back when there were kind of like three major religious groups in the country. You'd hear about Protestants, Catholics, and Jews. Those were the three, the three sort of foundational or the three major religious groups in the nation at that time, back in those days. And what they, with the advent of fascism, Nazism, anti-Semitism, institutional anti-Semitism in Europe, there were some liberal progressive scholars who began using the term to kind of indicate where Jews and Christians kind of overlap and talk about the tradition that's shared by Jews and Christians. But then particularly in the 1960s forward, it became a term used by Christian conservatives and even secular conservatives to describe basically a biblical, the biblical tradition as understood by Christians. Okay, so what they're talking about is, by Judeo-Christian, they mean the Hebrew Bible, or what many Christians call the Old Testament, plus the New Testament, and then maybe Christian teaching after, subsequent to that. What they don't mean, and this is one reason that many Jews object to the term, is that the Hebrew Bible is only one source of the Jewish tradition, and Judeo-Christian, as used by people like Robert Jeffress or David Barton, they're not talking about the whole oral Torah rabbinical interpretation tradition that's very important to Jews these days. So it's really, Judeo-Christian is kind of in a way, it looks pluralistic. It looks like it's including Jews and Christians, but actually it's leaving out much of the Jewish tradition. So it's really it means more biblical Christian. That's really what it comes down to, despite the Judeo part of it. And there are some in the Christian Americanism in Texas Politics report. I have some links to discussions of Judeo-Christian history, and then some of the criticism that's come up from Jews in particular.
Great, thank you. Our next question comes from Sadia, who asks, can you touch on the recent Texas school board disruptors, critical race theory, and maybe even mask bans as possibly tied to Christian nationalism?
Yeah, I'd like to be able to do that. I do have a report on Christian nationalists and the response to COVID, which kind of tangentially touches on the problems with masking and mask mandates, but it does that really came up after I completed that report. I think that it's in the background. I'm not going to be able to give a very satisfactory answer to that question because it's something that I need to research in the future. In fact, that might be a good topic for the next Baker Institute report. But I'm sure it's in the background. I'm sure it's part of. I'm sure Christian nationalism is playing some role in the anti-vax movement, the anti-mask movement, and certainly the anti-CRT, critical race theory movement, for the reasons I mentioned about the notions of the true founding, the authentic founding principles, and so on, seem to be at work in the opposition to critical race theory. But I haven't really researched it. I haven't gone into depth on that. But I'm pretty sure it's there. I can't tell you specifically at this point. It's a little too new, I guess, for me to comment on it.
Our next question comes from Samia, who says that, points out that there has been a lot of anti-Sharia sentiment from Americans, but then Christian nationalism seems like it can be this version of the thing that people have been criticizing. And so why are Americans not more wary of Christian nationalism? And on an individual level, how do we counteract such an organized Christian nationalist movement?
Yeah. Let's see. As to the second question, counteracting it is difficult because it's so pervasive in say the Republican Party in particular. Christian nationalism is just really merged into the Republican Party and become part of. You can find Christian nationalist planks in the Republican Party platform, both at the national level and here in Texas. So it's very hard to oppose Christian nationalism politically, other than just calling it out, for what it is, pointing out where it exists, where it's showing its head, and so on. The first part of the question about Sharia, there is a strong connection between Christian nationalism and the anti-Sharia law movement. Let's see. I had another report on the trials and tribulations of Shahid Shafi, who became the co-chair or the assistant chair of the Tarrant County Republican Party organization, and was subjected to all sorts of Islamophobic attacks, and actually had an emergency meeting of the Tarrant County GOP, which I attended as a reporter. I wasn't allowed into the actual the room where they were doing the deliberations to determine whether Shafi should step down as basically because he was Muslim, and that was the real problem that was coming up, was they thought many thought that a Muslim was not appropriate for the co-chair of the Tarrant County Republican Party, even though he was a very faithful Republican, had a long track record supporting Republican causes and candidates. And he stayed in his position. The opponents were in the minority, but were outvoted. But it did show the connection between Christian nationalists and Islamophobia, and that's talked about in that Baker Institute on the Shafi scandal, whatever you want to call it. Whitehead and Perry also have identified a close connection between Islamophobia and Christian nationalism in Taking America Back for God in that book. So that's another place you could look. Let's see, on Sharia, there has been some pushback that I understand from the Muslim community about calling Christian nationalism Sharia, or saying it's the same thing as Sharia, because Sharia can mean many things to Muslims. And it seems that the anti-Sharia movement thinks that well, it's founded on the idea that there's like one Sharia law that all of Muslims follow or something, and the anti-Sharia movement doesn't want to see that in the United States at all, even among tribunals settling family disputes and so on. But I mean, I can see the resemblance between a kind, let's say the Taliban's version of Sharia, or ISIS's version of Sharia, and some aspects of Christian nationalism, but it's probably better to just keep them as separate categories, in fairness to the Muslim community, rather than calling Christian nationalism, say, American Sharia or Christian Sharia or something like that, because it's really I think it's a different thing, and it really is nationalism. It really is a nationalist ideology, and that it sees our nation not necessarily the as with much Sharia, the religious teachings of the Quran, the Hadith, and so on, but Christian nationalism really elevates the nation, United States, as a kind of chosen nation, divinely guided, biblically guided, and so on. And so it does have, a nationalist character that's closer to Christian nationalism that we see in Hungary, or where's the other place? I can't remember, it's Poland or Czechoslovakia, where you have a rise in Christian nationalism that's often tied to opposition to Muslim immigration and immigration from others who are not the right kind of Christians, supposedly. So I don't know if that's helpful at all, but anyway.
Thanks. Our next question, we actually have questions both from Paula and Dan, who both ask about if you can speak to the rise of anti-Semitism and how that connects with Christian nationalism.
Yeah, I think most Christian nationalists would say that they're pro-Jewish. At least many of them are pro-Israel, usually on biblical grounds, and they would not consider themselves to be anti-Semitic at all. So Trump has had sort of dubious ties to anti-Semitism, and that he was very pro-Israel, certainly reached out to the Jewish community in the United States, not very successfully, but then also said of that was a Charlottesville Unite the Right riot, that there were good people on both sides. That includes anti-Semites, very vocal anti-Semites. So I think Christian nationalists, with their referral back to the Judeo-Christian tradition, are not consciously anti-Semitic. That is, they're probably consciously pro-Semitic, at least that's the way pro-Jewish, that's the way they think of themselves. But again, many Jews consider Christian nationalism to be anti-Semitic in its effect, because because their tradition, the tradition that leads to the kind of worship practices that we see today in the Jewish community, based on a long tradition of rabbinical interpretation, and then other possible sources of truth, say for Reconstructionist Jews or Reform Jews, those are left out of the vision of the Christian nation. Because the Christian nation is really oriented towards the Bible as conservative Christians see it. That is the Hebrew Bible plus the New Testament. And of course, Jews don't recognize the New Testament as authoritative, but they do recognize this rabbinical, just the oral Torah, and so on. So many, or at least some Jewish writers that I think I quote some or cite some in the report, really see Christian nationalism as anti-Semitic in its effect. Not necessarily in its intention, but in its effect, because it's trying to promote a biblical Christian perspective as preferred for law and public policy in the United States, basically ignoring the Judeo part of Judeo-Christian. And I mean, one example is the anti-abortion stance, very important in the for Christian nationalists, as I've mentioned. And many Jews support for abortion rights is very high among the Jewish community. So they're pretty much being locked out of this, Christian nationalist anti-abortion agenda as well. So maybe not anti-Semitic in its intention, but anti-Semitic in its effect. That's what I would say.
Well, thank you so much, David. We're pretty much at time. So we're wrapping up at 1 p.m. and we're at 12:58. So this has been a really wonderful, really informative, and we're really grateful for your time and for sharing all of your knowledge. I also want to say to everyone here, thank you for coming. We have all of your emails from when you registered for the Zoom link, and we will send you an email with links to the papers and sources that David has mentioned, as well as with a link to the recording of this event in case you'd like to share with others or view again later. So thank you all and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you very much.